Tonight, his success story has ended in tragedy with his sudden death at the age of 22.
Yesterday morning came the unbelievable news that Len Bias, only 22 years old, had died of an apparent heart attack.
People out here are absolutely stunned by the sudden loss of this
19-year-old University
athlete.
of Maryland football player. Jordan McNair's family says he died in May from heat stroke.
The strength coach has to go. The athletic trainer has to go. The head coach has to go. I'm not even sure what the delaying is.
What you just heard was the reaction from around the country on two of the most tragic days in the University of Maryland's history.
Hi, and welcome to Under the Shell, presented by Testudo Times. This isn't your normal episode of Under the Shell. This is a deep dive episode about two deaths that shaped Maryland athletics history. I am Brendan Weissel.
Sam Jane.
And Michael Howes. And you likely already know about the deaths of Maryland basketball star Len Bias and Terps offensive lineman Jordan McNair. Their tragedies are well documented, their stories have been told. But today, we're taking a new approach.
This isn't just a recap of what happened on the day of their deaths, but rather a deep dive into the impact that each death had on the University of Maryland. The athletic department wasn't only changed, but the university's economy, students, and long-term future was shattered by these deaths.
We talked to a University of Maryland president, teammates of both Bias and McNair, lawyers, and journalists who were present during both tragedies.
We looked at university records, school policy changes, fan attendance, and more. It was a long process, but we learned how each death forever shaped College Park, nearly 40 years later.
He said, if I were a university president, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, because you never know when you wake up in the morning what the athletes have done to cause you no end of trouble. Just like you said, it's shit on the porch.
Len Bias was one of the most successful basketball players in Maryland history. He played basketball in College Park from 1982 to 1986 and was nothing short of a superstar. In the summer of 1986, he was selected by the Boston Celtics in the NBA draft. He was a two-time All-American and energized the Maryland fan base.
But early in the morning of June 19th, 1986, Bias was in his Washington Hall dorm on the south side of campus with teammates celebrating his entrance into the NBA. The Washington Post reported that Bias snorted cocaine for 3 to 4 hours before having a seizure and collapsing. He died later that morning. Teammate and close friend Keith Gatlin was in the room when Bias died.
No, I mean, he was a phenomenal player. I mean, obviously that speaks for itself. He one of the best to ever do it at University of Maryland.
The reaction at Maryland was pandemonium. Here's Kevin Blackistone, longtime ESPN reporter and professor of the practice at the University of Maryland College of Journalism.
Your thoughts were that maybe there was some sort of accident, or maybe he had a medical condition, which is not, oddly enough, would not have been unusual. When I was growing up, there were two Maryland basketball players who dropped dead.
Sally Jenkins, a columnist for the Washington Post who covered Bias's death, jumped on the story on June 19th and was ahead of the police.
Everyone was stunned. You know, nobody, again, just like me, I don't think people could quite accept it at first. You know, there was an element of disbelief. The administration was so sort of, I think, dumbfounded and slow moving, and so were the campus cops, that me and another reporter, we knew what Len's car looked like, and we saw crumbles of crack cocaine or large grains of cocaine on the floor of the passenger seat.
Maryland players were just as confused, too. They went from being local celebrities, fresh off an NCAA tournament win, to being dragged into one of the most high-profile deaths in the entire country.
And you walk outside your dorm and you get 25 to 30 cameras and reporters in your face and walking with you. That's really hard to deal with.
Hidden behind the accomplishments of Bias in Maryland was an athletic department riddled with issues. Poor grades, drug problems, and a hands-off approach from the athletic department had signaled warning signs in the past.
Although head basketball coach Lefty Driesell had on-court success during his time at Maryland, his teams had problems off the court. According to Sports Illustrated, 15 of the 19 freshmen Driesell brought in from 1980 to 1985 did not meet the university's minimum admission standards. Their combined SAT average of 670 was 100 points below that of Maryland football recruits, and 355 points under the university average.
In the fall of 1984, Driesell's team had a collective 1.48 grade point average, just over a D+. Overall, only 4 Maryland basketball players in the previous 15 years had a B average for an entire academic year. That's all according to Sports Illustrated.
Drysdale and Chancellor John Slaughter had an interesting dynamic. It was reported that Drysdale had direct conversations with Slaughter about special academic exemptions for players that he wanted. Robert Dorfman, who led a task force investigation into the academic performances of Maryland athletics, talked about what he learned about the two.
We went through his ideas about what statistics were. They were very contrary to what statistics really is, and especially contrary to what the NCAA thought of statistics. The NCAA has graduation rates, or did then, of how many students came in and how many students actually graduated. To Lefty, that wasn't fair.
In late June, the academic counselor for the team, Wendy Whitmore, quit, telling the Washington Post that she felt education was not a priority at Maryland. She said players generally miss 35 to 40% of their classes during the season.
Both players we talked to about this offered interesting perspectives about the academic landscape before Bias's death. Here's former NBA player Len Elmore, who played basketball at Maryland from 1971 to 1974, and later pursued a law degree.
After I had broken my foot my freshman year, I thought, well, I'm here to play basketball, and if I can't play basketball, why am I here? I rarely went to class with a big cast on my leg, and I underachieved.
We asked Elmore if the academic culture in Maryland athletics was strong in the seasons prior to Bias's death.
The program cared about success in the classroom. The problem is you can only do but so much. I mean, if people are remaining eligible but not giving it 100%, that's all. That's about as far as a coach or a program can take you.
Keith Gatlin, who we heard from earlier, disagreed with the perception that Maryland's athletes were incapable of performing in the classroom.
And I think that the biggest misconception is that we had some party atmosphere going on where it was just partying and no structure, and that was such false material being put out there.
This wasn't just a player issue, though. The athletic department wasn't top-notch either. Reporter Sally Jenkins had an understanding that Maryland's perception of itself was much different from the reality.
Dingy is the best way to describe it. I mean, literally, from the arena itself was almost dingy. The offices were dingy. The people in various jobs were clearly not first cut. I always felt there was a gap between what Maryland projected in terms of its reputation and the dump that I covered.
The curtain wasn't just pulled back after Bias's death, it was completely ripped off. Maryland made striking changes in the weeks after. The ripple effect from his passing was overwhelming.
Jobs were lost. Drysdale was removed from his head coaching position and relegated to a small administrative role. Both Chancellor Slaughter and Athletic Director Dick Dole lost their jobs as well. Jenkins believed Maryland was clearly looking for a scapegoat.
In retrospect, I think there was a misplaced need for someone to pay the price for Len Bias's personal mistake. To this day, I'm not sure how Lefty Driesell or Dick Dole were culpable in Len Bias's death. But to me, the bottom line was that Len Bias killed Len Bias.
The university implemented 2 different task forces. One was on academics and one was on drug use. We talked to both men who were involved with each one. Robert Dorfman, a science professor who cared, let's just say, little about athletics, and Dave Irwin, a lawyer who worked under the U.S. Attorney General at the time, Benjamin Civiletti.
Dorfman's investigation was centered around the academic side. He was stunned by the difference between a student-athlete's academic regimen and a non-student athlete's.
I don't think they understood university life. I don't think they understood that Len Bias was nowhere near graduating when all of this happened. The coaches would say to me, my job is to win games. If the president tells me that my job is to graduate players, then I'll do my best to do that.
We got access to look at the recommendations Dorfman and his team made to the committee, and here were some of the key things they recommended. First, special housing for student athletes was recommended to be removed, and that they should be assigned to housing with other students.
Changes to athletes' studying infrastructure was also a big theme. Mandatory study halls were suggested to be replaced by a system of academic assistance. The main thing with that was that they took into consideration the individual needs of student athletes.
Because of the Dorfman report, Maryland took a look at what types of student athletes they were letting into the school, with an emphasis on the student part. The report called for a reduction in the number of freshman athletes who were admitted with academic records lower than those the university usually requires for admission.
Before 1986, Maryland accepted these types of students known as individual admissions, also known as IAs. In 1986, there was no limit on the use of IAs by the athletic department, which had 48 that year. Following the Dorfman report, the department was allowed a maximum of 18 freshmen and 3 junior college transfer IAs per year, according to a Sally Jenkins Washington Post article.
Now, the other task force was led by Dave Irwin, and he was more focused on drug usage on Maryland's campus.
The Attorney General wanted to know why increased drug usage was percolating around Maryland and other college campuses.
They found troubling results. The impact of both committees' suggestions to the Board of Regents was immediate. Here's Dave Irwin.
The result of that, sadly, the catch-22 there is that the teams and the quality of players on the teams went down, and Maryland went from winning records to losing records for the next 5 years. But then some of the policies that had been instituted got scaled back so they could have better ball teams again.
The funds of the university were also impacted. Irwin says the university as a whole took a massive hit.
There's a link between athletic success and donors, not just donors to make bigger stadiums, but donors to the school in general. And the more kids that want to go to the school there, the higher quality of the athletics.
Those university struggles made it harder for the Terps to recruit high-level players.
And the athletic teams struggled. In the 4 years following Bias's death, Maryland's men's basketball and football teams slumped within the ACC. The basketball team went a combined 55-64, 13-43 in conference play, with just one NCAA tournament berth. The football team went 17-25-2, 11-14-1 in ACC play, but with no bowl bids. Non-revenue sports struggled to even get players to come to Maryland.
The whole psyche of the university was affected by this tragedy for years.
Fan attendance lagged as well. Prior to Bias's death, Cole Fieldhouse consistently ranked in the top 30 in the country for crowd size. The year after Bias's death, attendance dropped to 48th in the country. The 8,186 person average was the lowest attendance for Maryland between 1986 and 2006. It took 8 years after Bias's death to crack back into the top 20.
The problems weren't limited to basketball either. Football's attendance decreased 40% between 1985 and 1990. The crowds continued to dwindle in the following years after Bias's death.
Maryland athletics was in shambles. The budget was one of the lowest in the country, and the entire department was embroiled in serious debt.
The school walked a fine line. They needed to take actual measures to make sure nothing terrible happened again. But they were also limited in keeping up with the rest of the ACC athletically.
When Drysdale left in 1986, Bob Wade, who had no college coaching experience and had only coached at Dunbar High School in Baltimore, proved to be a poor hire for the basketball team. To give him the benefit of the doubt, he was hampered by some restrictions that were in place. 3 years after Bias's death, legendary Maryland coach Gary Williams was eventually hired.
But even the legendary coach struggled in his first few seasons. Williams complained that the Terps weren't able to compete because of the restrictions in place from Wade. Here's Don Marcus, who covered the team for the Baltimore Sun, on how it affected the school athletically.
It's just a very hard time at Maryland for anybody, and parents didn't want to send their kids who were athletes to school there because of that.
After a stretch of poor football and basketball records, the university made changes. Restrictions loosened. Things shifted to better support the athletic teams. Maryland was able to bring in more academic exemptions.
Eventually, the university and the programs rebounded, but Bias's death lingered over the university and the nation for years. It changed how people perceived the drug cocaine even. Here's Kevin Blackenstone on the topic.
I think a lot of people, even in the black community, who thought crack cocaine was being criminalized unfairly compared to powder cocaine, all of a sudden, because of someone you celebrated, someone in your community had suffered this tragic death from it, all of a sudden began to change their viewpoints about it.
Coaches at other schools used the death as a negative recruiting point against Maryland, but some people at the university weren't so worried about the success on the playing field.
If people want to come to the university so they can go to basketball games, let them go to Las Vegas or someplace like that. My concern always was this place is a school. If the number of applications drops or the number of admitted students drop, fine. I really couldn't care.
The impact of Bias's death from 1986 will forever be felt at the University of Maryland. In 2012, Maryland cut 7 teams, and in 2014, Maryland moved from the ACC to the Big Ten. We asked Don Marcus if budget trouble and fallout from Bias's death led to these moves.
It was a starting point. Now, whether that might have happened with something else, we don't know. But it also contributed to Maryland having not a great reputation as a place to go as a destination school for athletes, because especially Olympic sports, because they went there with the fear of their sport being cut eventually too.
It's unclear the way in which the university currently feels about Bias's death. Some say that it was a young man's mistake. Others say that the culture at Maryland contributed to his passing. About 40 years later, Maryland was unable to fulfill many public information requests surrounding Bias's death, citing a time frame extent. Yet, the university encouraged current students to attend a 2021 game against Virginia Tech by giving out Bias's esteemed number 34 gold jersey for free.
The university made it a priority for Terrapin athletics to never be under the nation's scorn again. Task force were formed, there were resignations, firings, and strict restrictions put into place. The university worked to ensure a tragedy like this would never happen again in College Park.
Instead, almost 30 years to the date, another Maryland athlete passed away. Jordan McNair's death is different from Len Bias's, but the ensuing reaction and impacts mirror each other.
Jamie, new details tonight on the death of the University of Maryland football player Jordan McNair. We just came out of a press conference that told the media about the report.
Before May 29, 2018, Jordan McNair was an unrecognizable offensive lineman on a football team that garnered little national attention.
McNair had been a stud in high school, though, a 4-star recruit with offers from Alabama and Ohio State, but he chose to stay home and play for the Terps in 2017.
Teammate Ellis McKinney grew up in the same neighborhood as Jordan. We spoke to McKinney about what McNair was like as a teammate, friend, and role model.
In the locker room with the offensive line, he was a character. He's always funny, always cracking jokes. A big NBA fan. He's one of those offensive linemen who, we always say if we were a little skinnier, we'd be playing in the NBA instead of playing football.
He played one game during his freshman year and redshirted that season. McKinney took McNair under his wing to guide him through a new culture and life playing college football at Maryland.
Newly hired head coach DJ Durkin's culture was shocking to many. He had to adjust to how Durkin approached the job.
It felt like an adversarial environment where it was the coaches versus the players, where they told us that, we weren't worth a damn thing and they knew what was right. And, that's kind of what led to a lot of the issues was that we were a losing program. And so here comes this guy who's telling us this is how the job's supposed to be done. And, what are we supposed to do?
On May 29, 2018, McNair collapsed during a team practice after showing signs of exhaustion. His teammates had to help McNair reach the finish line of the team's 10th 110-yard sprint. Team trainers failed to spot the signs of heat illness during the practice. His body temperature reached 106 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 8 degrees over the regular body temperature.
6 days later, on June 4th, the university announced that McNair was hospitalized after a team workout, noting that he was in critical but stable condition.
McNair's parents started a GoFundMe 2 days later, disclosing that the offensive lineman had received a liver transplant. Then, on June 13th, Jordan McNair died with the cause of death being unknown at the time.
Between the May 29th workout and the announcement of McNair's passing, there was a little reporting about what had actually transpired on the practice field. The Baltimore Sun reported that Durkin was present that day, but not much more.
That all changed on August 10th.
ESPN released a story that changed everything. Multiple contributors wrote more than 3,000 words on the, quote, toxic culture that had festered under Durkin's watch. Now, national scorn was levied once again at Maryland.
When they did that, that was when it was like, okay, now it's really go time. Now everyone is on this.
That was former Diamondback editor James Crabtree Hannigan, who covered the Maryland football team and the death of McNair in 2018.
The ESPN article outlined that Durkin, along with head strength coach Rick Court and other staff members, created a culture of toxic masculinity. That included swearing at players while forcing athletes to watch workouts, eating candy bars, among other actions.
The article showed that the way McNair was pushed to exhaustion was not a surprise to those on the team, given the program's toxic culture. And now, it was not a surprise to the public either.
McNair and Bias's deaths were different. Bias died as a result of his own actions. McNair's death was part of a toxic culture fostered by the coaching staff at the University of Maryland, and a grave mistake by the trainers.
Therefore, the subsequent reactions to each death weren't the same. There are also clear similarities between the two, the parallels easily identifiable.
For a school president that wasn't innately tied or experienced in athletics, McNair's death opened up a whole new set of problems for former President Wallace Lowe.
Lowe didn't deliver any punishment to Durkin until after the ESPN article was released. But a day after his football team was a frontline news story, Lowe placed Durkin and the two trainers involved on administrative leave.
3 days after that, on August 14th, Lowe announced that the school accepted, quote, moral and legal responsibility, end quote, for McNair's death. It was an announcement that had massive implications.
That absolutely got some people's attention because that's not usually the response, and that's not the response that a lawyer would tell you to make if you were concerned about liability or anything like that.
Lowe also said that he was forming an independent committee to investigate the toxic culture at Maryland. It didn't last long. The University System of Maryland Board of Regents assumed control of the investigation 6 days after Lowe announced that Durkin was on leave.
The players were involved in said investigation. They were interviewed and asked to offer insight into Durkin's team culture. This was a big moment for a player like Ellis McKinney, who finally thought that his voice was going to be heard.
And shocker, the university paid study turned out that they don't have a toxic culture.
As McKinney alluded to, the university declared that the Maryland football team didn't have a toxic culture, but did have a culture where problems festered because too many players spoke out. You can make your own interpretation on that.
The Washington Post obtained and published a copy of said report. Still, on October 26th, in the middle of University of Maryland's football season, the trio of athletic director Damon Evans, Wallace Lowe, and the Board of Regents decided to reinstate Durkin as the head coach.
It was an eye-opening moment for some Maryland players. They felt like they had made their opinion known about Durkin. Keep in mind that during this period, athletes rarely spoke out against coaches, programs, and universities. For Terps players, it was a risk to publicly criticize Durkin. A lot has changed since that time. McKinney said, if this happened in 2024, two things would be different.
Number one, this was before the transfer portal. So there's no way of getting out there and knowing that you're kind of fairly safe. Like you can just, you'll put your information out there and be able to get reached out to by other coaches. Transferring was a much different and more difficult process. But it was also before 2020 and before a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement that we saw a lot of player activism during that time.
As you heard McKinney say, if it were easier for players to leave their school, this incident may have looked very different.
Paul Feinbaum even said that we were giving ourselves the self-death penalty by keeping DJ Durkin as a head coach because what mom is going to send their kid to go play for him?
Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, amongst other stakeholders, spoke out against Durkin's reinstatement. Finally, the pressure was too much for the university's management, and after practice on October 31st, Durkin was fired. Matt Canada was named interim head coach for the second time that year.
The Terps finished the season 5-7, with a marquee win over Texas to begin the season and an infamous overtime loss to Ohio State.
That wasn't enough to keep Canada's job. Maryland hired Michael Locksley from Alabama after he won Assistant Coach of the Year in 2018. Locksley signed a 5-year deal worth approximately $2.5 million annually.
3 years later, Locksley finally had his dream job. But that didn't mean Maryland would have success right away. As the team continued to slowly rebuild under Locksley, the attendance has risen. Maryland had its most attendance in 2023 since the 2015 season. The team won their third straight bowl game under Locksley and had their second straight 8-5 season. Fan attendance increased by 5,000 fans over the 6-season span.
Despite average attendance in 2023 being the highest since before McNair died, between 2017 and 2023, Maryland lost money in ticket sales. That, according to Sportico.
But that wasn't the only money that the university lost in that time period.
Maryland state government officials approved a $3.5 million settlement in 2021 from the University of Maryland to McNair's parents.
We spoke to Malcolm Ruff, who worked on the case as a member of the Murphy, Falcon, and Murphy law firm that represented McNair's family.
We felt at the end of the situation, at the end of the entire case, once it did settle, that was a fairly appropriate sum of money to address what had happened. But obviously, no amount of money would ever have made this right.
The university paid them $3.5 million from unrestricted university funds, according to a Maryland spokesperson.
As a part of the settlement, the university also announced a partnership with the Jordan McNair Foundation to raise money and awareness about heat exhaustion, concussions, mental health, and nutrition.
2 other Maryland football players were represented by the same law firm and also received $200K each for a settlement with the university about abuse claims.
And that was Gus Little and E.J. Donahue. And they also had some really horrific stories about their injuries being ignored and their mental health being crippled.
Ruff said that if McNair had not died, DJ Durkin may still be the head coach at the University of Maryland.
And what's, I think, more troubling is the fact that DJ Durkin, despite having been at the helm of this university program when Jordan was run to death, is still a viable, candidate for coaching, is making tons of money, still coaching in the NCAA system.
Both DJ Durkin and strength coach Rick Court have jobs with football teams this season. Court working with high school players.
Like I said, he's part of that old boys club that is these college football coaches, and they do what they can to make sure their friends keep their jobs and keep making their millions of dollars. Whether or not a kid lost his life isn't of consequence to them. So I'm not surprised by that. I wish that there would be people with more courage to run people like DJ Durkin out of the sport, people who don't have the care for the student athletes the way they should. But it's just the reality of the situation.
Loxley had a clear emphasis on repairing the program's culture when he took over for Durkin.
McNair's death caused a coaching change, a budget problem, and tension between boosters and the president. If that sounds familiar, it's because Len Bias' death had a similar impact.
While the 2 tragedies were different, collegiate scandals and deaths bring wide-scale impacts across entire campuses, including College Park.
As many people describe to us, athletics are like the front porch of universities. When a team's winning, the porch looks sunny. When things go wrong athletically, the university as a whole takes a hit.
After each death, Maryland placed harsher guidelines on its athletic programs. It plummeted the revenue of the sports team records and attendance. It's well and good to say you care about change, but when money isn't arriving in the form of boosters and others' pockets from sports, it's harder to maintain those same restrictions.
Here's President Wallace Lowe.
And I had no idea of the impact, for example, of major donors to athletics. And boy, they expect to be heard.
Those donors also expect results.
And I can tell you that our donors, they care only about one thing: winning games.
At the time, Maryland obviously wasn't a winning football program, but we asked Ellis McKinney how things could have been different if they were.
It's tough because you like to say that if we were reigning national champions and a player dies in the summer that we're going to take accountability the same type of way, but it's a tough answer. Who's to say? And then, who's to say the circumstances around the next one?
Maryland paid the price for each incident. In McNair's death, that meant in court. In Bias's case, the athletic department's budget was decimated.
Other people at the school felt the fallouts from the deaths. Some thought those fallouts were a necessary reaction. Others wanted little change.
A university is a unique place. Different people have different ideals, especially about athletics. In a new era of collegiate sports, some folks, like Dorfman and Lowe, are focused on the integrity of a school's education and standards.
But if people don't donate because we took certain actions after the death of McNair, I'm not even sure I want them to be donors of the university.
But others are aware of the importance of winning. Money, attendance, and school applicants rise with strong sports teams.
It's when those 2 ideologies intersect under the cloud of tragedy, like in 1986 and 2018 in College Park, Maryland, when tensions bubbled.
The deaths of Jordan McNair and Len Bias created substantial change at the University of Maryland.
It caused people to lose their jobs, reshape departments, and more.
The 2 events happened almost 40 years apart, under completely different circumstances.
And yet, they will always be tied together.
The university is connected to 2 of the most impactful deaths in collegiate athletics history. After each, a theme of never allowing something like this to happen again emerged.
But if these tragedies tell us anything, it's that a school never truly knows about what happens under their watch.
And the impacts know no bounds.
Winning is important, but it's not as important as, life and as building, strong and productive student athletes for their life after their time at the university.
For Under the Shell, I'm Brendan Weissel.
Sam Jane.
And Michael Howes. Thank you for listening.